Hello, you. It is me, and I'm here for part 2 of The Sound Machine by Roald Dahl, and I'm very excited about it. I hope your July 4th was good. Mine was extremely loud, but we've been having firecracker problems or fireworks problems for about a month and a half now. Last night hopefully was the crescendo for all of it, and we will be done. But I did have some hot dogs, and that was fun. Anyway, alright, so back to The Sound Machine. We are right at the point where, let's see, Klausner, it's still a hard name to say, but Klausner, has gone outside to the garden to test his machine, which makes noises that are normally not audible. So he's out to test it to see how it works. And here we go. He stood there in the garden besides the wooden table, so pale, small, and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. There's some words for you. The sun had gone down. Oh. This was how yesterday was. Car alarms were going off every 5 minutes because the pops were so loud. Apparently, car alarms are still going off. I don't know if you hear them or not. I don't know if the mic is picking it up. But it's irritating. Music blaring from underneath me, car sirens to the side of me, the right of me. Oh, thank God it's over. Okay. Sorry for that interruption. It's like a really annoying commercial. So let's continue. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next yard, and there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on the front. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved a needle across a large central dial, like the wavelength dial of a radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands, starting with 15,000 and going to 1 million. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked to one side in a tense, listening attitude. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move, and in the earphones he could hear a faint, spasmodic crackling. Behind this crackling sound, he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself, but that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each ear was connected to his head by a thin, stiff wire like a tentacle, and that the wires were lengthening, that the ears were going up and up toward the secret and forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. The little needle crept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek, a frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. He stared around as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. There was no one outside except the woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhumane shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor, metallic quality that he had never heard before. Klausner looked around, searching intensively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing in sight. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand, and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this point, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses, and turned to walk away. "Mrs. Saunders!" Klausner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement. "Oh, Mrs. Saunders!" And looking around, the woman saw her neighbor standing on the lawn, a fantastic arm-waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head, calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed. "Cut another one, please! Cut another one, quickly!" She stood still, staring at him. "Why, Mr. Klausner," she said. "What's the matter?" "Please do as I ask," he said. "Cut just one more rose." Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. No, she thought, no, he's harmless. I'll just humor him. "Certainly, Mr. Klausner, if you like," she said. She took her scissors from the basket, bent down, and snipped another rose. Again, Klausner heard that frightful, throatless shriek in the earphones. Again, it came at the exact moment the rose stem was cut. He took off the earphones and ran into the fence that separated the two gardens. "All right," he said, "that's enough. No more, please, no more." The woman stood there, a yellow rose in one hand, clippers in the other, looking at him. "I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders," he said, "something that you won't believe." He put his hand on top of the fence and peered at her intently throughout his thick spectacles. "You have, this evening, cut a basketful of roses. You have, with a sharp pair of scissors, cut through the stems of living things, and each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. Do you know that, Mrs. Saunders?" "No," she said. "I certainly didn't know that." "It happens to be true," he said. He was breathing rather rapidly, but he was trying to control his excitement. "I heard them shrieking. Each time you cut one, I heard the cry of pain, a very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it." "Did you really, Mr. Klausner?" She decided she would make a dash for the house in about 5 seconds. "You might say," he went on, "that a rosebush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You'd be right, it hasn't. Not like ours, anyway. But how do you know, Mrs. Saunders?" And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper. "How do you know that a rosebush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts his stem into as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with a garden shears? How do you know that? It's alive, isn't it?" "Yes, Mr. Klausner. Oh, yes. And good night." Quickly she turned and ran into the garden to her house. Ran up the garden to her house. Klausner went back to the table. He put on the earphones and stood for a while listening. He could still hear the faint crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine, but nothing more. He bent down and took hold of a small white daisy growing on the lawn. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment that the stem broke, he distinctly heard in his earphones a faint, high-pitched cry, curiously intimate. He took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but he wasn't sure now that it expressed pain. No, it wasn't pain. It was surprise. Or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, a single, emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the roses. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably didn't feel pain. It felt something else which we didn't know about, something called toin, or spurl, or plucknuckment, or anything you like. He stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark, and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the house all around. Carefully, he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shed, and put it on the workbench. When he went out, locked the door behind him, and walked up to the house. The next morning, Klausner was up as soon as it was light. He dressed and went straight to the shed. He picked up the machine and carried it outside, clasping it to his chest with both hands, walking unsteadily under its weight. He went past the house, out through the front gate, and across the road to the park. There he paused and looked around him. Then he went on until he came to a large tree, a beech tree, and he placed the machine on the ground close to the trunk of the tree. Quickly he went back to the house and got an axe from the coal cellar and carried it across the road into the park. He put the axe on the ground beside the tree, which is something nowadays, if you tried to do that, you'd be arrested before you hit the park. Or, in the cases of places where they're defunding the police, they'd probably kill 5 people before anyone noticed. But let's continue. We'll try to keep our politics aside. Then he looked around him again, peering nervously through his thick glasses in every direction. There was no one about. It was 6 a.m. He put the earphones on his head and switched on the machine. He listened for a moment to the faint, familiar humming sound. Then he picked up the axe, took a stance with his legs wide apart, and swung the axe as hard as he could at the base of the tree trunk. The blade cut deep into the wood and stuck there, and at the instant of the impact he heard a most extraordinary noise in the earphones. It was a new noise, unlike any he had heard before, a harsh, noteless, enormous noise, a growl, low-pitched, screaming sound, not quick and short like the noise of the roses, but drawn out like a sob, lasting for a full minute, loudest at the moment when the axe struck, fading gradually fainter and fainter until it was gone. Klausner stared in horror at the place where the blade of the axe had struck into the wood flesh of the tree. Then gently he took the axe handle, worked the blade loose, and threw the thing on the ground. With his fingers he touched the gash that the axe had made in the wood, touching the edges of the gash, trying to press them together to close the wound, and he kept saying, "Tree, oh tree, I am sorry, but it will heal fine." For a while he stood there with his hands upon the trunk of the great tree, then suddenly turned away and hurried off out of the park, across the road, through the front gate and back into the house. He went to the telephone, consulted the book, dialed a number, and waited. He held the receiver tightly in his left hand and tapped the table impatiently with his right. He heard the telephone buzzing at the other end, and then the click of a lifted receiver and a man's voice, a sleepy voice, saying, "Hello, yes?" "Dr. Scott," he said. "Yes, speaking." "Dr. Scott, you must come at once, quickly, please." "Who is this speaking?" "Klausner here. And you remember what I told you last night about my experience with sound, and how I hoped I might—" Yes, of course. But what's the matter? Are you ill?" "No, I'm not ill. But it's 6:30 a.m, the doctor said. "And you call me, but you are not ill?" Please come quickly. I want someone to hear it. It's driving me mad. I can't believe it. The doctor heard the frantic, almost hysterical note in the man's voice, the same note he was using to hearing in the voices of people who called up and said, "There's been an accident, come quickly." He said slowly, "You really want me to get out of bed and come over now?" "Yes, now, at once, please." "All right, then, I'll come." Klausner sat down beside the telephone and waited. He tried to remember what the shriek of the tree had sounded like, but he couldn't. He could remember only that it had been enormous and frightful, and that it had made him feel sick with horror. He tried to imagine what sort of noise a human would make if he had to stand anchored to the ground while someone deliberately swung a small, sharp thing at his leg so that the blade cut in deep and wedged itself in the cut. Same sort of noise, perhaps? No, quite different. The noise of the tree was worse than any known human noise because of that frightening, toneless, throatless quality. He began to wonder about other living things, and he thought immediately of a field of wheat standing up straight and yellow and alive, with a mower going through it, cutting the stems, 500 stems a second, every second. Oh my God. What would that noise be like? 500 wheat plants screaming together, and every second another 500 being cut and screaming. And no, he thought, I do not want to go to a wheat field with my machine. I would never eat bread after that. But what about potatoes and cabbages and carrots and onions? And what about apples? Oh no, apples are all right. They fall off naturally when they're ripe. Apples are right if you let them fall off instead of tearing them from the tree branch. But not vegetables. Not a potato, for example. A potato would surely shriek. So would a carrot and an onion and a cabbage. He heard the click of the front gate latch, and he jumped up and went down and saw the tall doctor coming down the path, little black bag in hand. "Well," the doctor said. "Well, what's all the trouble?" "Come with me, doctor. I want you to hear it. I called you because you're the only one I've told. It's over the road in the park. Will you come now?" The doctor looked at him. He seemed calmer now. There was no sign of madness or hysteria. He was merely disturbed and excited. They went across the road into the park, and Klausner led the way to the great beech tree at the front of which stood the long black coffin box of the machine and the axe. "Why did you bring it out here?" the doctor asked. "I wanted a tree. There aren't any big trees in the garden." "And why the axe?" "You'll see in a moment. But now please put on these earphones and listen. Listen carefully and tell me afterwards precisely what you hear. I want to make quite sure. The doctor smiled and took the earphones and put them over his ears. It's funny, they keep saying earphones. I want to say headphones. Every time I see it, I want to say headphones because, they're headphones now. Klausner bent down and flicked the switch on the panel of the machine. Then he picked up the axe and took his stance with his legs apart, ready to swing. For a moment he paused. "Can you hear anything?" he said to the doctor. "Can I what?" "Can you hear anything?" "Just a humming noise." Klausner stood there with the axe in his hands, trying to bring himself to swing, but the thought of the noise that the tree would make made him pause again. "What are you waiting for?" the doctor asked. "Nothing," Klausner answered, and then he lifted the axe and swung it at the tree, and as he swung, he could swear he felt a movement of the ground on which he stood. He felt a slight shifting of the earth beneath his feet, as though the roots of the tree were moving underneath the soil. But it was too late to check the blow, and the axe blade struck the tree and wedged deep into the wood. At that moment, high overhead, there was the crackling sound of wood splintering and the swishing sound of leaves brushing against other leaves. And they both looked up, and the doctor cried, "Watch out! Run, man! Quickly run!" The doctor had ripped off the earphones and was running away fast, but Klausner stood spellbound, staring up at the great branch 60 feet long at least, that was bending slowly downward, breaking and crackling and splintering at its thickest point, where it joined the main trunk of the tree. The branch came crashing down, and Klausner leapt aside just in time. It fell upon the machine and smashed it to pieces. "Great heavens!" shouted the doctor as he came running back. "That was a near one. I thought it had got you." Klausner was staring at the tree. His large head leaning to one side, and upon his smooth white face there was a tense, horrified expression. Slowly he walked up to the tree, and gently he pried the blade loose from the trunk. "Did you hear it?" he said, turning to the doctor. His voice was barely audible. The doctor was still out of breath from the running and the excitement. "Hear what?" "In the earphones. Did you hear anything when the axe struck?" The doctor began to rub the back of his head. "Well," he said, "as a matter of fact." He paused and frowned and bit his lower lip. "No, I'm not sure. I couldn't be sure. I don't suppose I had the earphones on for more than a second after the axe struck." Yes, but what did you hear?" "I don't know," the doctor said. "I don't know what I heard. Probably the noise of the branch breaking." He was speaking rapidly, rather irritably. "What did it sound like?" Klausner leaned forward slightly, staring hard at the doctor. "Exactly what did it sound like?" "Oh, hell," the doctor said. "I really don't know. I was more interested in getting out of the way. Let's leave it." "Dr. Scott, what did it sound like?" "For God's sake, how could I tell? What with half the tree falling on me and having to run for my life?" The doctor certainly seemed nervous. Klausner had sensed it now. He stood quite still, staring at the doctor, and for fully half a minute he didn't speak. The doctor moved his feet, shrugged his shoulders, and half turned to go. "Well," he said, "we'd better get back." "Look," said the little man, and now his smooth white face became suddenly filled with color. "Look," he said, "you stitch this up." He pointed to the last gash that the axe had made in the tree trunk. "You stitch this up quickly." "Don't be silly," the doctor said. "You do as I say. Stitch it up." Klausner was gripping the axe handle, and he spoke softly, in a curious, almost a threatening tone. "Don't be silly," the doctor said. "I can't stitch through wood. Come on, let's get back." "So you can't stitch through wood?" "No, of course not." "Have you got an iodine in your bag?" "What if I have?" "Then paint the cut with iodine. It'll sting, but that can't be helped." "Now look," the doctor said, and again he turned as if to go. "Let's not be ridiculous. Let's get back to the house and then paint the cut with iodine." The doctor hesitated. He saw Klausner's hands tighten on the handle of the axe. He decided that his only alternative was to run away fast, and he certainly wasn't going to do that. "All right," he said. "I'll paint it with iodine." He got his black bag, which was lying on the grass about 10 yards away, opened it, and took out a bottle of iodine and some cotton wool. He went up to the tree trunk, uncorked the bottle, tipped some of the iodine into the cotton wool, bent down and began to dab it into the cut. He kept one eye on Klausner, who was standing motionless with the axe in his hands, watching him. "Make sure you get it right in." "Yes," the doctor said. "Now do the other one, the one just above it." The doctor did as he was told. "There you are," he said. "It's done." He straightened up and surveyed his work in a very serious manner. "That should do nicely." Klausner came closer and gravely examined the 2 wounds. "Yes," he said, nodding his huge head slowly up and down. "Yes, that'll do nicely." He stepped back a pace. "You'll come and look at them again tomorrow?" "Oh, yes," the doctor said. "Of course." "And put some more iodine on?" "If necessary, yes." "Thank you, doctor," Klausner said, and he nodded his head again, and he dropped the axe, and all at once he smiled, a wild, excited smile, and quickly the doctor went over to him, and gently he took him by the arm, and he said, "Come on, we must go now." And suddenly they were walking away, the 2 of them walking silently, rather hurriedly, across the park, over the road, back to the house. And that is the end. That was pretty intense, the sound machine. I wonder how much that would F somebody up. Could you imagine? You pluck a rose and it screams? That would stop me from plucking any more roses, that's for sure. That was not what I expected from the story, but I kind of liked it. That's pretty good. I hope you enjoyed it as well. So that is the ending of The Sound Machine. And in the next video, let's see, maybe we'll tackle another one from this book. How's that? There's 10 great authors. We've hit the first one, so we've got 9 more to go. Maybe I'll just choose at random, and then we can read that one. That'll be fun. Anyway, that's all I gotta say.